right, good afternoon, everyone. You know, it's always the faculty you have to get to stop talking. The students are great. All right, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Berteau. I'm the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs. Sarah, I'm gonna have to call you out. Sorry.
Hold on, John.
Hi.
I don't think they can hear you in the back.
Oh, I don't think this is the.
You need to know?
I don't,
Okay.
okay, you do this or good? I can, I've been a professor a long time, I can be lying. So good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Berteau, I'm the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs. And it really is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2024-2025 Distinguished Scholar Teacher Lecture Series. For those of you who don't know, the Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award was established in 1978 to recognize tenured faculty members who are committed to and have demonstrated excellence in instruction and in their research efforts. The award is sponsored and administered by the Office of Faculty Affairs on behalf of Provost Jennifer King Rice, and the recipients are selected by prior DST awardees. I'm very pleased and honored on behalf of Provost Rice to recognize Dr. Linda Steiner as one of our newest Distinguished Scholar teachers. As you will hear more shortly, Dr. Steiner is internationally recognized for her many significant contributions at the intersection of gender and the media. In addition to her research, Dr. Steiner has contributed significantly to the university's learning environment, engaging students in the courses she teaches and through her mentorship. Provost Rice and I congratulate Dr. Steiner on this much-deserved award and recognition. It's now my pleasure to introduce Rafael Lorente, Dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism, who will formally introduce Dr. Steiner.
Thank you, John. So I take great pleasure and pride in introducing Distinguished Scholar Teacher, Professor Linda Steiner. Dr. Steiner has served as a professor at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism since 2006. She is a world-leading expert on women in the media and has produced a body of work that is remarkable for both its breadth and depth. She is the author or editor of 11 books, more than 80 refereed articles and chapters, and dozens of conference papers on gender and communication. Professor Steiner is one of the leaders of research-centered teaching at Merrill College, serving as PhD chair to 19 students since arriving at Merrill. She is an active and extraordinarily respected member of our college and university, and importantly, of the broader journalism and communications academic community. Professor Steiner is the recipient of the 2020 Eleanor Blum Distinguished Service to Research Award from the Association of Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, which we all know as AEJMC. She is also the past president of AEJMC, the central academic organization in the field of journalism studies. In 2018, she received the Teresa Award for the Advancement of Feminist Scholarship from the International Communication Association. And for the past 8 years, Professor Steiner has edited the Journalism and Communication Monograph series for Sage Publications. Professor Steiner's work spans more than 4 decades of research on how and when gender matters in news and newsrooms, as well as critical analysis of how feminists use media. Her research has been central in moving the discussion of gender into the mainstream of communication studies, embedding our understanding of the role of gender within broader social, political, and economic forces that shape the media. Her recent projects have explored contemporary issues, such as the framing of race, as well as women's responses to online harassment. She has won research funding for her work, including from the Carnegie Knight Foundation and from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to analyze the role of journalists in coverage of genetically modified foods. I could go on, but it's not me you're here to listen. As reflected in the Blum Award I mentioned a second ago, which is given to those who have devoted their careers to promoting research and mentoring students, some of whom are here today, Professor Steiner is a generous scholar, teacher, mentor, and supporter of communication studies. For many PhD graduates have gone on to successful academic careers at Georgetown, at USC, at Pepperdine, at the University of Georgia, and elsewhere. On a personal note, I was on the search committee that recommended Professor Steiner almost 20 years ago. More recently, Professor Steiner became a source of counsel and quiet mentorship for me when I first took on a leadership role as Associate Dean in 2015. Late in the evening, when most everyone is already home, I would often find her in her third floor office. As someone who came from the professional ranks of news, I would sometimes stop in with a question about how these university places work. She was always clear and always had good advice. And inevitably, our conversations would veer down interesting avenues about music or history and, of course, journalism. Today, as the college's Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and DEI, I count her as a trusted advisor and as one of the hardest working human beings I have ever met in my life. Congratulations, Professor Linda Steiner.
So, thank you very much for coming, including those of you online. I'm really honored by the award and honored by your presence here. I'd like to thank everyone by name for helping me thrive at Maryland and at Merrill. But here's a group shot. And I also want to thank people in the Office of Faculty Affairs and, again, graduate students I've had over the years. But I can't name everybody, so I'll just name a couple. I want to name Sarah Oates and Natalie Cosner, who worked tirelessly to make this award happen. Clint Bucco, who usually helps me keep my sanity. And of course, Raphael, who really has been a friend since the beginning. I want to also acknowledge the support of my children. And what would I do without my husband, Ed, who is here and has helped me through rocky challenges. So I also want to single out among my many wonderful former graduate students, Sheena Eckert, who said yes when I suggested a manifesto about highlighting why we should distinguish sex and gender. I was so excited by this idea that I immediately drafted the entire essay. And then Stina said yes again when I suggested co-editing a book of research-based manifestos, and that book will be out soon. And it includes the manifesto from former student Carolina Veloso. So today, I want to explain the rationale between distinguishing between sex and gender terminology and other terms, and the importance of precise wording about sex and gender. So by gender terms, I mean women, men, non-binary. These get at conceptions that are social and cultural constructions, and they are performed. In contrast, terms like female and male and intersex refer to biology, and they manifest in reproductive organs. So gender describes how society or culture ascribes correctly or incorrectly to women, men, and non-binary or non-cis persons, different kinds of values, different traits, expectations, and it also refers to how people self-identify and take up those traits and values or don't. Notably, gender traits are more malleable than biology, although we do see surgical and medical interventions. But scholars and journalists continue to conflate these two terms, as if knowing that someone who presents as a woman or a man by virtue of pronouns or hair or jewelry or clothing indicates whether they're female or male. That doesn't work that way. So I'm going to suggest that conflating gender and sex is wrong, logically and philosophically, that reducing humans to their assumed reproductive organs is insulting, that reifying a sex binary semantically erases non-cis persons, and that distinguishing between sex and gender highlights outdated, irrelevant, and limiting concepts. It exposes the arbitrary baggage that otherwise hides how such ideas get normalized and institutionalized across space and time. So as a result, and I'm going to come back to this repeatedly to explain it, but just to start, I call for both the word women and men to be used as both nouns and words that modify other nouns. For instance, writing about a woman journalist or a man reporter. At least when gender is relevant, and certainly it's not always relevant. When it's not, fine, skip it. So we do mark power dynamics through our language choices. Victor Klemperer, famous philologist who actually started out as a journalist in Berlin, wrote about how Nazi propaganda co-opted German expressions to inculcate Nazi ideas. He emphasized language changes that most people actually never noticed. He called these the language which writes and thinks for you. So it's not merely semantics. And these days, we are usually talking about gender or gender differences, except for sports and medicine and some other scientific fields that deal with bodies, literally. We rarely are going to be talking about biology or sex differences. So I call for consistently using gender terms when gender is the issue, or when the biological sex of a human subject is unknown or irrelevant. That is, let's default to a gender vocabulary. And the confusion is very much caused by scholarly and journalism style books and textbooks, and then it's enforced by major elite magazines and newspapers. So one problem is claiming to discuss gender, but then reverting to female. So for example, the inclusive journalism textbook's chapter titled Gender nicely describes the powerful role of news media in shaping and changing notions about gender, and then adds females are underrepresented with a faulty implication that males represent the social norm while females are insignificant and invisible. This makes no sense. Or take another oxymoronic journal article titled, A Socialization Perspective on Male and Female Reporting, which contends that females, like females in other professions, bring different values and priorities to newsrooms. So today I'm going to give some other examples of the problem and how it leads to sloppy thinking. I'll try to counter some of the typical arguments against my proposition, and I will provide specifics for journalists, journalism educators, and scholars about how to acknowledge gender in practice. So let me also admit that a greater precision with vocabulary doesn't solve the problem of sexism and false binaries, such as the notion that feminine newsroom management style is more democratic and constructive and good, while masculine management is more autocratic and competitive, bad. But sloppy language, again, obfuscates the normalization of essentializing stereotypes, such as women are from Venus and men are from Mars. The point is to use the appropriate term. Sometimes we might want to refer to women as females to underscore how women are sexualized, objectified, or reduced to biology. Sometimes we want to highlight the sex gender system. Sometimes we need to name sexism when people are unfairly treated on the basis of gender or sex. Indeed, I think very often sexism is really a much more clear way of naming a significant problem than is the term gender issues. The concept of gender is a more capacious, flexible term. There are many more, I might be off. Sorry. The concept of gender is a more capacious, flexible term. There are more ways of being a woman or man or a non-cis person than of being male or female. So gender is a useful starting point to find nuanced, robust ways of addressing long-standing problems. However, now I want to get to this slide. To use the word gender as a fixed binary, or worse, referring only to women, as if men are not equally gendered, creates more political and empirical kind of research havoc than it solves. Unfortunately, because women scholars pushed for the concept of gender as a way to solve the problems of sex, gender scholarship is now largely produced by women and deals with women. Gender representation nearly always refers to images of women. Again, this defeats the nuance intended by the term gender. So a little history. Merriam-Webster notes that the word woman for an adult and lady emerged very early in language. Female showed up later in the 1300s, referring to a woman or a girl, but by the 1400s, it was also used for animals. Skipping to the 1900s, arguments emerged over these three terms, but consensus emerged against female for humans because it applied to animals. Ladies initially meant women in charge of households. Then it became something used for high-ranking women. Lady seems to be making somewhat of a comeback now. Journalist Anne Friedman, for example, who describes herself on her blog site, Lady Journos, is curating the work of female journalists. But then she says, Lady splits the difference between the infantilizing girl and the stuffy Census Bureau cold woman. It's a way to stylishly signal your gender awareness. I don't really understand why the word woman is cold, but I'm not going to fight it. But I do think that fussy terms of politeness, such as ladies, again, for a polite, well-mannered woman, should remain a title of nobility. Over the course of the 20th century, the word sex increasingly implicated sexual intercourse. This growing association of the word sex with sex acts created a problem, at least for the prudish. Ruth Bader Ginsburg explained that in 1975, 18 years before she became a Supreme Court justice, her secretary complained that the word sex is on every page of Ginsburg's appellate briefs. So the secretary said, for the 9 men on the Supreme Court, their first association is not the way you want them to be thinking. She added, why don't you use the word gender? It is a grammatical term and it will ward off distracting associations. By the way, an extreme obsession with vulgarity long accounted for a avoidance of other embodied language. So chairs had legs, but ladies had limbs. In any case, for Ginsburg, and many subsequent scholars across disciplines, much of gender's appeal was that it seemed and seems neutral, scientific, non-accusatory, even as it gets conflated with female. As recently as 2022, the American Psychological Association adds a cowardly and inconsistent note saying using gender instead of sex also avoids ambiguity over whether sex means sexual behavior. So Ginsburg's practice took hold, but it did produce a backlash. In 2007, the language expert and New York Times columnist William Safire quoted an irate reader complaining about feminism, who called Nancy Pelosi the first woman speaker of the House. The reader asked, is there some inherent power or stigma to female that spawns timidity? Safire sympathized, boasting, when faint-hearted sociological euphemists were pushing the gentle grammatical category gender, I stood up for the plain old Anglo-Saxon word sex. Now, Safire admitted, not only was the word sex disdained and rooted in biological running about, but females seemed doomed to a similar lexical fate. Safire ended his column saying, feminists everywhere have begun to turn on the word female. What's next? Yes, feminists turned on the word, but not because of timidity. So I'm going to give you 4 reasons why differentiation is important. 1, treating gender as sex and then referring to static dichotomous differences is philosophically wrong, unethical, and empirically incorrect. It ignores how we are actually more than our gender. And language that dichotomizes gender and treats women as a fixed, self-evident category actually diverts attention from other issues. For example, classism and racism. This is why journalism language or research, and I could actually say, because Raphael mentioned my 40 decades of work, that probably 40 years ago and 30 years ago, maybe, who knows, I don't think 20 years ago, but 30 years ago, I made the same mistake. But the problem is, assuming that women share unique interests as reporters and editors or as news readers, fails to notice how women's interests really are those of white middle-class heterosexual women. And secondly, journalists and scholars actually almost never know the sex of the people that they write about, not only at the general level when they're referring to a mass of people, but also at the level of the individual. Although they'll talk about a female editor or a female executive or a female mayor, as if they knew what was in that person's underwear. Unlike other animals, human genitalia are not visible. The Ume told me to have really good words in the title and in the speech, you know, so here I'm like obeying OFA orders here. Correctly, journalists and scholars very rarely ask people about their sex, but they do not peek underneath the underwear to check for reproductive organs. I'm not saying they should check. Of course, they should not care. It's irrelevant. Categorizing people as male or female also undermines solidarity across genders. It forces people into untrue positions. It erases the 1.7% of the human population who are intersex as well as even larger numbers of people who are non-gender conforming. What we want to do is acknowledge human variability and diversity and stop obsessing about sex and gender differences. And then fourthly, whoops, I forgot, they're on the same slide. Sex difference actually doesn't usually matter. It's not a medical condition like scoliosis, which calls for amelioration. Indeed, apart from reproductive organs, most discussions of sex differences rely on problematic assumptions. Take the highly popular notion that female and male brains are entirely distinct. Neuroscientists find that humans' brains almost always show a mosaic of characteristics associated with both sexes. Females may have slightly more female brains, more gray matter, and males, more male brains, more white matter, but always have a mix of features. Now, there are three, I think, bad or weak reasons for resisting this call. One is that in the context of contemporary culture wars and status battles, the very concept of gender challenges holders of power and apparently incoming powers too. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, that nearly 1,000-page platform for the second Trump presidency, would ban diversity efforts and critical race theory, but also woke gender ideology in higher education. It would forbid interpreting sex discrimination regulations as prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, and sex characteristics. It says higher education should, quote, focus their enforcement of sex discrimination laws on the biological binary meaning of sex, unquote. That is, the project simply rejects the very concept of gender. Secondly, there are some people who say word choices don't matter. It's just words. In 2014, the journalist Alice Robb wondered how a bunch of authors dealt with the political correctness conundrum and asked 8 successful women whether they would rather put the word woman or female to modify various professions. So 2 linguists preferred things like woman boss because female boss seemed to refer to an animal, not humanity. The famous sociolinguist Robin Lakoff said both seemed equally old-fashioned, but then very weirdly, she added her regret that reference to female gender must be made even when it's irrelevant. But one, no one suggests introducing the issue when gender is irrelevant. And secondly, what is female gender? That makes no sense. To my surprise, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum and other journalists didn't see any difference. To them, the 2 words were interchangeable. And then third, and I think this is actually the most likely reason for the resistance to my proposal, is that grammarians object to the use of the apposite noun. Apposite noun refers to a noun that works like an adjective. Sometimes it's called a noun adjunct or an attributive noun. So the New York Times and the New Yorker, my otherwise 2 favorite sources of information, object to the apposite noun. And during the campaign, often quoted people hoping that Kamala Harris would be the first female president. Now, relatedly, some people are opposed to a positive adjective because it's not equally related, applied to men. So the 2024 AP style book says, if elected, Kamala Harris would be the first female president or the first woman to be elected president. But they don't like the phrasing first woman president because they say it could be grammatically awkward, especially if the words man or men would not be used in a parallel sense. Now here, I have to admit, I would abandon my whole campaign and I'd return my DST plaque to John Berteau if it meant that the United States could have elected a female president. That's what I would- But Merriam-Webster offers 14th century examples of using woman to modify another noun. My point is, this has a very long history. Actually, already in the 2nd century, the Roman poet Juvenal mentioned a woman grammarian. Skipping more recently, Mary Norris, the New Yorker's comma queen, who's absolutely dead set against the appositive noun, 8 years ago accused New Jersey Senator Cory Booker of alienating the grammar lobby simply in a bid to ingratiate himself with women when he said that if he won the Democratic nomination, he would choose a woman running mate. According to Norris, Booker should have said a female running mate. Norris added, "You would never refer to Cory Booker as a male candidate, although you can't call him a man candidate either. Cory Booker is a man senator, and he is correct, as awkward or odd as the language sounds." Objecting in a similar way to using woman as an adjective because it sounds weird for men, Rob said, "The comparable male version sounds so ridiculous, no one would ever run it outside a feminist stand-up comedy routine." Also oxymoronic, right? Is there such a thing as a feminist stand-up comedy? Thank you for laughing. So she gives as examples, man cyclist, man politician, man writer. Male cyclist, she said, sounds less ridiculous. But reversing the usual cliche, what is good for the gander is good for the goose. The opposite noun should be used for both men and women, and even the publication manual of the APA now discourages using male and female as nouns, and it is somewhat open, I'm quoting them, to the use as adjectives. So here's my continuum. The worst, because it's incoherent and non-parallel, is to say men dominate sports reporting and females dominate reporting about personal finance. Or because it makes a man normal and a woman the marked odd unusual case. He was voted the top sports reporter and she was voted the top female sports reporter. Very bad, but at least parallel. Males dominate sports reporting and females dominate reporting about personal finance. Now, again, there are easy ways to avoid this problem. The no-brainer is men dominate sports reporting and women dominate reporting about personal finance. But correct, grammatically correct, and philosophically correct, albeit awkward sounding, is men reporters should not earn more than women reporters, no matter what they write about. And here's a quote from the Chronicle of Higher Education story that shows why it's really necessary to be very careful about the word female versus woman, or careful about the difference between sex and gender terms, and did so correctly, whether or not you agree with the sentiment. So the Chronicle said, Martina Navratilova, a professional tennis player, is a member of the Women's Sports Policy Working Group, an advocacy group that believes the purpose of a women's sports category is to exclude men. She sees the recent decisions as female athletes taking matters into their own hands. And then there is this quote from Martina saying that women-based spaces actually should be based on sex and not on gender identity. In any case, the fact that the opposite noun sounds even more weird for men, and I admit that it does, than for women is no reason to stick with tradition. What sounds right may be misleading and unhelpful. And modern dictionaries rely on usage in contrast to my inherently prescriptive approach in offering a manifesto. Lexicographers typically add a word to a dictionary when they determine that a lot of people use it and largely in the same way, and it has sort of staying power and utility. That is to say, if we say it enough, we'll get used to it, and then the style books will accommodate, they'll adjust. And those who worry about othering people by indicating gender have, and say we shouldn't indicate gender, have no problem mentioning Black journalists or gay journalists or young journalists, or Turk-made journalists. Notably, by the way, what's really going on here is how man is the unmarked, normal condition, while women are over-mentioned, just as white is in contrast to Black journalists. So there are journalists and Black journalists, unfortunately. And heterosexual is the unmarked term in contrast to, let's say, bisexual. In any case, if words for race and sexual orientation can be used as adjectives and nouns, why not women? So, given these strong arguments, as well as the flaws in the counter arguments, I would urge this usage even if it were not grammatically kosher. Allyship trumps grammar. And as Steiner and I argue, epistemological coherence overrides grammatical correctness. But in fact, again, it is consistent with proper grammar. And we can get used to new sounds and new usages. If we heard it often enough, we'd start to use it ourselves. Language and society don't change in lockstep. Sometimes one changes faster, sometimes the other. Style books and news media can lead the way, but sometimes they don't lead the way. One example of people leading the way is that people use the plural pronoun they for a single person of undefined sex, even when it was clearly ungrammatical. I remember telling my parents when they wondered whether I went to the movies alone, and I'd say, no, I went with them. Well, it wasn't really saying. And after years of that, the AP style book and Merriam-Webster recognized they as a pronoun for an individual. Since 2019, the APA has also endorsed the use of they, saying this avoids assuming gender identification when none is given or obvious, or when it's irrelevant, but also because it avoids a gendered reference. If you're writing about a person who uses they as a pronoun, then yes, you have to use it. Respectful and inclusive language is important. Here. With the courtesy title Ms., news media led the charge. One Massachusetts newspaper proposed Ms. in 1901 as a term that avoided embarrassing situations like making a mistake. Of course, the AP style book and many news organizations don't use any courtesy titles these days. It saves all those little words, all those little titles, and no one has to worry about checking which is the correct title. But the use of the word Ms., and this is for Christoph's students, really took up steam in the 1970s when women wanted to be recognized as individuals rather than being identified by the relationship with a man or lack thereof. So Ms. Magazine editor said in 1972. And now the etiquette maven Judith Martin, aka Miss Manners, that's a little weird, called Ms. a clever, useful innovation, adding, if we're lucky, Ms. will eventually become the standard female title. Half of US women, according to public opinion polls, now accept Ms. Putting it better, New York Times opinion writer John McWhorter astutely explained why some changes are relatively easy, although others meet a lot of resistance, saying it's easy when it's connected to matters of social justice, noting how quickly many Americans, especially teenagers, became comfortable with the new usage of they. He added, to a time traveler from just 20 years ago, gender-neutral pronouns would seem unlikely keepers. What probably makes the difference is the sense that to adopt these usages is to promote the interests and preference of people making their desires known from outside the traditional loci of power. So, notions of masculinity, femininity continue to mutate, becoming more fluid and complex. And someday, actually, I'm going to write another manifesto, and maybe I'll get another award, who knows, regarding the need to disentangle the conflation of gender, sex with masculinity and femininity. Again, these are historically situated concepts that mutate over time. Sexism continues also in ways that are linked to historical and cultural eras. Common sense conventions, time-bound constraints, routines, editorial structures, the historical culture of the newsroom, and above all, market dictates add up to create content perceived to sell. So sex sells, and sexist writing sometimes sells. This also sometimes means that to earn a buck, women could be required to write in ways that confirm stereotypes of women, even if they don't want to. So the problem isn't how topics of interest to females or even women are ignored, but how we all ignore sexism or sexual harassment, or how journalists, and for that matter, sometimes journalism students, to sexualize themselves. Narrowly making decisions on the basis of sexuality and physical attractiveness is still exploited in newsrooms. A double standard continues to be applied for market advantage. Women are continued to be asked to abet this kind of pandering to sexism, to perform a kind of weird feminist identity to play up cat fights among women, to kind of provide intellectual cover for news organizations that say, oh, well, we're not criticizing feminists. It's a woman herself from our newsroom who's doing this. So a whole set of feminist interventions is necessary. Feminist thinking urges contextual and situated journalistic forms that get at reasons, consequences, impacts. It centers collaborative, non-competitive, horizontal work structures, experiments in newsroom structures, content, policy, decision-making that could use feminist theorizing are crucial for journalism to serve all people. All journalists should pay attention to a wide range of important topics, and then they should be respected for doing that. So using the right language is merely a first step. Oh, did I get off again? Sorry. There we are. And now, I invite your questions. And Allison, are you logged in?
Yep.
Great. So people who are online could post questions in the chat, and Allison will relay them to me. And those in the audience, I'd love to hear your comments and questions. Daniel.
Fascinating as expected. I want to explore a little bit more about this thing about the awkward sound of woman president and man reporter. I mean, as someone whose first language is not English anyway, and everything sounds weird. I wanted to hear your thoughts about the role of journalists and communicators as a whole in this seeming tension of not being awkward and weird, which we can call frictionless communication, and embracing that some things seem to us awkward and weird, and maybe our role is to use them as to make evidence that the world is awkward and weird, and we should confront with that.
Yeah, well, when news organizations started using the courtesy title Ms. for a while, they would say Ms. Steiner, and then put in parentheses, as she prefers to be known, and then go on to the rest of the sentence. So for a while, they explained their rationale for doing it that way, and then they just dropped the rationale, figuring it, okay, now people are accustomed to it. So I would say that the same thing could be done with things like the use of the opposite noun. We understand that this sounds awkward, but it's philosophically correct. And then soon, I think, people would get used to it. I mean, we make changes in our language all the time, but yeah, it's so arbitrary. And as a non-English speaker, you probably had to memorize the gender of all kinds of words that for us are just like things. And that never understood how people could memorize that. So I'm sure you're up for this. Yes.
Thank you very much for introducing this into discussion. I think the question I'd like to ask is, you're calling into common parlance, like woman president versus man reporter, in cases where the gender, where the gender, I don't even know if I'm using the right word, where the gender matters, and
Right.
not to use it when the gender doesn't, is my understanding.
Correct.
And so I just wanted to ask about, it seems to me that at least culturally and maybe from a safety perspective, there are a lot of situations where the man as an adjective, the use of man as an adjective is not relevant, whereas the use of woman is due to things like safety concerns. I mean, if you could address that.
Yes, well, I think you're right, and thank you for the question. I'm quoting John here. He always would say when we were at office meetings, thank you very much for that, Linda, meaning I don't know what to do with it. I think it becomes apparent when comparisons are being made. So, or again, we want to talk about a first or, you know, something that is significant given the history. So he was the first man editor at a woman's magazine, something like that. So that then it would be relevant. But I can understand that when we are only talking about issues that women might face in newsrooms, sexual harassment is not exclusive to women, but it's primarily associated with them. And they have to go to greater lengths, right, to avoid in-person and online sexual harassment. Then we can talk about the harassment that women reporters face, and we don't have to talk about men at all. And when we're talking about things that face all reporters, then we'll just drop the term. Any reference to gender. Okay,
I was wondering whether you would then advise also to replace men in compound words with something such as a person, for instance, a snowman, does it then become a stone person, or penmanship, does that then become pen personship, right? I'm wondering whether you would also advise us, if we're making interventions into language, to go all out.
well, you're a lot younger than I am, so you go all out. I've been very self-consciously trying to make a bunch of changes that avoid man, like chairman, or fireman. I would never say that. I had never thought about penmanship. But you're right. And of course, there were feminists, kind of radical feminists. I remember some decades ago who were uncomfortable with the very word woman because it had the word man in it. I'm old, so now I pick my battles.
Linda, there are 2 online questions.
Go for it.
This is from Pallavi. She says, thank you so much for this wonderful or this powerful manifesto. What can journalism educators do to embrace this beyond the technicality of grammar in our classrooms?
Well, thank you, Pallavi. I do think that beginning with the grammar is good, again, because it highlights things that we might not pay attention to otherwise. But I also think the next steps are, as I kind of mentioned in passing, to highlight those occasions when we think we're talking about something, but we really have confused it with something else. So we think we're talking about gender issues, but it's really only about an issue for women, like maybe certain kinds of sexual harassment. And so it's really not an issue of gender issue, it really is sexism, or kind of the reverse when we're really talking about a very specific kind of woman, even though we are universalizing it. So we're universalizing the white heterosexual middle-class woman as a proxy, and that's illegitimate as a proxy for all women. So that's where I begin. And was there a second question there?
Yes, this is from Stina. Would you see that due to the political climate that there could be a ban on gendered language and language that points to gender, not sex? Could there be a ban on gendered language and language?
Well, yes, I mean, I do fear that, to the extent that, Linda McMahon and, adopts, the Project 2025 language that does actually deny the very concept of gender. So, I mean, it remains to be seen how bad it could get. But I would not discount that as a possibility. I mean, Pollyanna is my middle name, as all of my former students know, but I'm pretty pessimistic, on this score. Sarah, or Christoph, and then Sarah, right?
First of all, absolutely brilliant presentation. I'm learning so much. I'm writing here. What advice would you have for social science researchers, such as myself, who want to study disparities in what people face in their professions that are essentially based on gender, but are interviewing people who are used to using words related to sex to describe how they identify in terms of gender? Do we meet them linguistically where they live, or how do we approach that kind of conversation when we're interviewing people? Any advice on that?
Well, I'm betting that you could, be interviewing any number of people. Let's say weather reporters and meteorologists, and sort of, commit yourself to this kind of language of gender. And the people that you are, interviewing won't even notice it. So I don't think anyone is gonna be put off by your saying, well, do you think your experiences are particular to you as a woman or a woman meteorologist? Or have you been sexually harassed as a woman, because you're standing up and you're wearing a sheath dress and blah, 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 blah. So I would be surprised that you would have to worry that they're gonna be alienated by this. Again, when we get into these, somewhat awkward, situations of where man is put in front of, the word man meteorologist. I mean, yes, it really does sound a little weird. You could avoid it by just, using the noun men who do weather reporting or whatever. And so go forth and do your work. Sarah.
So, yeah, this has been a great presentation and I'm jealous of your slides and they're great. And, so I know that your team that you often work with, Steiner and Carolina, those are, you know, a German speaker, a native speaker, and a Portuguese native speaker. And so in Ukraine, and Deanna's gonna tell me out here, she actually speaks Ukrainian, and I only kind of do. They've now, female journalists now refer to them with a feminine ending on the word journalist. So I think it's like journalistka. Yeah, how many Ukrainian and Russian speakers do we have in the room? And they're doing this because the word journalist, it's just assumed to be male. So they've kind of made up, but then they're sort of then genderizing things that maybe they should have left alone.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you've ever considered how this issue is handled in other languages, other countries, or do you think that could be a great project here?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I know for sure that the suffix ending has very clear political overtones that people in different countries use differently. So, for example, as someone who studied for my dissertation, the women suffragist press, women in Britain refer to suffragettes, and American women said that the ETTE ending was infantilizing. So they refused to call themselves suffragettes because it sounded like they were like cute and little girls. So they insisted on using IST, suffragist. So I don't know, again, if we were gonna invent a whole new language with Gaia in charge of the brigade, maybe we could come up with new endings that would, call into question the automatic assumption that, you know, the word in Ukrainian or some other language, for a journalist is a man, and then it has to be adjusted for women. But I do think that in general, when one term is unmarked because it refers to men, so the notion of the sports reporter or the doctor or the journalist, and then there's this other term that has woman in front of it, that really is problematic. All right, so two more questions, and then I think there are refreshments outside. So, Nini, your hand was raised?
Yes, just a quick comment on this language differences, because I come from Georgia, the country of Georgia, and we have our own very unique alphabet, very unique language. And for me as a Georgian, it's a non-binary language, so we don't have a gender pronoun. I never knew what gender pronoun was till the age of 7, when I started like learning English, and I had a whole trouble to use he and she until today. I know they make like trillion mistakes about that. Then it was Russian, and the same came over there. Then it was French, and whole new mess came into my life. The problem, I think, is that so the Georgian, for example, Armenian, Farsi, they don't have gender. For culturally understanding, sometimes even the gender pronoun for me, it's kind of a problem to get into the discourse. Has there ever been, based on your research, any conversation to ever replace the pronouns and like do it as in Georgian? Is in Georgian is a gender neutral pronoun that refers to she, he, it, they, whatever it can be.
Yes, well,
Just as a
definitely,
one word.
right, and if you
Very
look at,
efficient language,
yeah,
yes.
if you look at the University of Maryland's pronoun guide, you'll see suggestions about pronouns that people may actually use for themselves that do not indicate gender.
Mhm.
And the assumption, I think, is that people who use these kind of made up pronouns that are new, not going back centuries and centuries, are going to be used by non-gender conforming people, but we could all use them. And I think that might actually also be true of Esperanto. So again, there are already people who have said, I'm just not going to use a gendered pronoun, absolutely. And then I give you the last question.
Lovely presentation. You touched on the idea that sort of undercurrent of our discomfort about, you know, calling politicians a male politician, when we want to call women politicians, all the time, is that there's sort of an assumed neutrality to maleness, especially in the professional field. And so my question for you is, as we move into a new era of writing in journalism, should the goal be to continue to feature gender in a way that's more featuring of all gender identities, or is it the goal to kind of flatten and make gender a non-issue in our journalism?
Yeah, well, I don't think I'm gonna see it in my lifetime. But the feminists who sort of grabbed onto the idea of a sex/gender system and then pushed for elaboration of theorizing over gender, very much hoped that eventually this all would become irrelevant. And we wouldn't have to talk about gender anymore. Again, it's not gonna happen in my lifetime. I think maybe not in yours either, but may you live a long life. And, but to answer your question seriously, I think we need to use the vocabulary that helps us solve problems. And to the extent that this is a problem, we need to use the right words. When it's no longer a problem, then we won't have to use those words anymore. So thank you very, very much.